You know, I'm often asked about just a series of issues. You know, should we do this? Should we do that? Should we screen current workers or just future workers? And on and on and on and on. Can we use 12-year-olds in the nursery? You know, there's no legal answer to those questions. A key question to me to ask is this. When you're looking at policies in your church, what you should do or shouldn't do, what would our jury pool expect us to do? Who am I talking about? I'm talking about the people you run into at Walmart or at the public library or at other public venues in your community. These are the people that are going to judge your church as to whether it was careless or negligent in the selection of workers. What will they think about what your church did or did not do? That is an excellent question to have in mind. And I think the last few years have been pivotal in the media feeding frenzy that's been given to this issue of child molestation in churches. The fact is this: the public will no longer accept church leaders' excuses for doing nothing. It's too expensive. It takes too much time. We've never had this problem. And on the excuses go. You would not even want to make these excuses in court to justify your inaction. In fact, if we could look at a typical courtroom scene in one of these cases of child molestation, think of the dynamic situation. The victim and the victim's parents are sitting here in the courtroom. The mother is weeping. The child has been victimized. The senior pastor is called to the stand and asked, what did your church do to protect against this injury from happening? And all too often in this country, the answer to that question is nothing. But think of a church whose pastor goes to the witness stand and says, well, here's the written application that we used for this offender. We interviewed him. We did reference checks. In fact, here they are. We have 3 reference checks from other institutions where this individual worked with minors. Every one of them says, we know of no reason why he would not be suitable for working with minors. We had a 2-adult rule and explain it. We have a 6-month rule. He was not allowed to work with minors for 6 months. And we did a criminal records check. What's the jury thinking? What more could these people have done than what they did? And when they start thinking that way, your congregation is not going to be found liable on the basis of negligence or a failure to exercise reasonable care. Now, let me just mention a couple of options here. The first is a website called nsopr.gov. That stands for National Sex Offender Public Registry. That is a website that collects all of the state's sex offender registries. You can plug in a name and indicate what state you want to search. I recommend you do an all 50 state search, a national search, which you can do. And it will list for you every person with that name who is a known registered sex offender anywhere in the United States. And if you have a very common name, you may see multiple hits. Well, each one of those hits will tell you if that person is currently incarcerated or not. Well, that helps weed it down. And secondly, it will give you a color picture of that individual that will assist you in knowing, is this the person standing in front of me here that wants to teach a second grade Sunday school class? So that's a very important tool. You don't need a Social Security number. You don't need consent. You can just go online and do this. At a minimum, you should be doing that. Churches have been found liable because for many reasons, but one of the reasons that you see occasionally is that a known sex offender was molested at 1 or more children at church, and the church could have easily found out on a publicly available registry if this person was a sex offender, and they didn't do it. Let me just mention this. The nsopr.gov sex offender registry is very limited in a number of ways. These registries in many states only go back to a specified date, which is fairly recent in some states, maybe 2000, 2002. So information going before that date is not going to be available from these websites, and that makes them very limited. Secondly, they only cover specified criminal behavior. And there may be a host of other crimes out there for which you want to disqualify this individual from consideration that are not going to be covered. Let me conclude with a few points. Number one, the statistical data that were reviewed today, I think you will appreciate that this is an issue that demands our serious consideration. It is the number one reason that churches have found themselves in court over the last couple of years. Number two, I've tried to emphasize that the church's response does not have to be so complex and burdensome that we can't implement it, but rather with relatively few and simple steps, we can significantly reduce this risk of harm to our children. It is an issue, it is a challenge that demands our best efforts. Don't be part of the majority of churches that are doing nothing to respond to this risk. Not only will that expose children in your church to victimization, but your own church to substantial liabilities. This is an issue that demands your best efforts.
So, you've learned how to screen and select great staff and volunteers. Now let's get down to the second most important aspect of keeping kids safe, supervision. So often in ministry, our best intentions get thwarted by circumstances beyond our control. And if you're like most churches already running lean on staff, let's face it, finding children's ministry volunteers can be a real challenge. But hang in there. In this next segment, we'll take a look at the kinds of scenarios you'll likely be faced with. When I ask, what's wrong with this picture, you'll have about 30 seconds to brainstorm a solution. And that's about the same amount of time you'll have in real life to solve the situation. I guarantee you'll come up with solutions for handling even the toughest supervision challenges in ways that keep your kids safe and protect your church legally. So are you ready? Okay, let's take a look at our first situation in the toddler's room. It's Sunday morning, you're in the toddler's room, and there are 2 adults and 6 toddlers. Well, everything's going fine until one of the toddlers starts acting up. Why? Well, maybe he didn't have breakfast this morning. Maybe he has a tooth coming in. For some reason, he's a toddler. He's having a bad morning. So one of the adults says, I'm going to take him out of the room because we don't want to drag down the other 5 toddlers. Probably a great decision. However, this adult takes the toddler out of the room to go read with him in another area. What's wrong with this picture? As you may have guessed, both supervisors are in the violation of the 2-adult rule. No one is available to monitor either leader's actions. This might not seem like a big deal, but statistically, most incidences of sexual abuse will occur when someone is being transferred alone from one location to another, and the proper safeguards are no longer in place. Here's one way these workers could have handled their situation. While they were both in the same room together, they could have called for backup, because let's face it, they needed backup. When another adult arrives, the adult with a fussy child could then leave the classroom and go into the hallway to read a book where there are other people present. With this solution, both workers have maintained the 2-adult rule while addressing the needs of the one toddler who needed to leave the classroom for a while. Now here's another tip. When working with toddlers, they will often want to sit with you as you play or read them a book. Having the child sit beside you on one knee is a much better practice than having a child directly on your lap. In other words, always try to avoid placing a child in a way that covers your own private area. Are you ready for the next scenario? Good. Let's move on to the preschoolers. Many churches rely on youth volunteers to help fill the gaps in their staffing for children's programs. This is a great way to mentor young people into leadership positions for the future. But there's an inherent risk to putting youth workers in charge of small children. That's because nearly half of all reported sex abuse cases include a minor molesting a younger child. Whenever there's a disparity in power, whether it's because of age, size, or position, the level of risk increases. And whenever the level of risk increases, you need to upgrade your supervision level as well. Look at the scenario in this preschool classroom. 2 adults and 1 youth worker in a room filled with 10 kids between 3 and 5 years old. This preschooler needs to go to the bathroom. We all know that means it's a very urgent situation. So, the youth worker escorts the child out of the room, down the hall, and quickly into the bathroom. What's wrong with this picture? Knowing the increased risk of pairing an older child with a younger one, youth workers should never be allowed to handle children in isolation. Personal activities such as using the bathroom or changing diapers are prime opportunities for sexual misconduct to occur. So whether you're a youth worker or an adult, the 2-person rule always applies, especially in the case of bringing children to the bathroom. So in this situation, it would have been better to call in another adult and then leave the student helper assisting in the classroom. Then the 2 adults could escort the child down to the bathroom. Now here's a hint. Before letting that child enter the bathroom, check to make sure no other adults are in there already. Additionally, the adults should wait outside of the bathroom door to make sure that no one attempts to enter while the child is inside. It's important to make sure you have solid bathroom policies that everyone follows. Now, let's move on to middle school. Preteen and teenage kids are the most vulnerable to sexual abuse, and they frequently volunteer in a variety of areas around the church, oftentimes in isolated areas. In this scenario, a 12-year-old boy has been invited to assist the worship production team by serving in a dark sound room with a production technician. He probably enjoys messing around with all the great equipment in there. That's what makes it a popular area for kids to volunteer. But what's wrong with this picture? Right away, I'm sure you noticed that these 2 people are alone in a dimly lit, soundproof room. High risk. Church staff need to identify areas of high risk throughout their facility. For instance, a sound room is a high-risk area. Youth should never be allowed to enter when only 1 adult is present. And the production booth is only one area around the church to consider. Often, young volunteers will do custodial work around the church. This again may put youth in an isolated, unattended area where the risk level increases. So building child protection programs doesn't just apply to your classroom and children's ministry. It needs to be a church-wide effort to safeguard all children throughout every area of the church. And finally, let's visit the high school ministry. This last scene is a common scenario, especially for youth pastors. Their success relies on building relationships with students, and often, youth pastors will set aside one-on-one time to develop these relationships. Great idea, but it can put both the student and the pastor in an extremely vulnerable situation. For instance, after Sunday night youth group, 2 kids need a ride home. The youth pastor decides to drive them both home. He drops off the first student and is left driving the second student alone. What's wrong with this picture? What are some other ways this youth pastor could have dealt with the problem of two kids needing a ride home? Well, first, the youth pastor should have called both kids' parents to get permission to drive their kids home. But he also should have made arrangements to avoid being alone with a second student, maybe asking another adult at church to accompany him in the car. It's an extra step for sure, but avoiding any appearance of impropriety, let alone the temptation to do anything inappropriate while alone with a student, is well worth the extra effort it takes to safeguard the kids in our care. Ideally, plan ahead so that you are never in a situation that breaks the two-adult rule. You've done a great job today. Thanks for thinking through this so carefully. Creating supervision policies and implementing them takes time and effort. But without these safeguards in place, you and your church run the risk of being liable for allegations of sexual abuse. As we learned from our roundtable discussion with the experts, sexual abuse claims are devastating churches financially, and they're doing untold damage to entire faith communities. Fortunately, there are ways to mitigate this kind of loss. Watch this next segment to find out how.
We brought Steve on as a volunteer teacher for our middle schoolers. He didn't have any kids of his own, but his energy and passion for the kids was inspiring. We did all the necessary background and reference checks before we placed him as a Sunday school teacher. And then when we observed him in the classroom, he seemed to have such a good rapport with the kids. He could relate to them. Once we saw how well he managed his students, we thought that we had an asset to our teaching program.
There is no, particular profile at which you could look at and say, this is what they look like. As soon as they walk through the door, you'll know it. It's just not a reality. They come in every age, every size, every background and experience and socioeconomic status. There is no one particular profile that you could say, this is the case.
Until the day I got the first phone call. A parent of one of the students had said that she'd noticed Steve instant messaging her daughter on several occasions. There was nothing suspicious about the actual communications, but the parent's antenna had gone up. This kind of after-hours interactions with her daughter made her very uncomfortable.
To be able to identify some of the risk behaviors, what do you do? What are the behaviors you do not do with children? And as you said, Roger, that's an opportunity for the supervisor to talk about the conduct of behavior that's expected with children within the entire context of a volunteer or an employee, and have them sign off on it so there's a sense of responsibility.
I followed up with Steve immediately. I simply told him that a parent called to say she was uncomfortable with him communicating with her daughter, and I asked him to tell me more about the ways in which he interacts with his students.
The risk behavior does not say this person is an offender. They're at risk, and what they're doing is not healthy for the child.
Steve agreed to stop contacting students on the computer and to respect the boundary of developing relationships at church only. And then I documented our conversation. Everything seemed fine for several months. And then I got another phone call from a parent who insisted that we meet immediately in person. She and her husband came to my office right away. Their 10-year-old daughter had told them that Steve had said some things that made her feel scared. He had said something like, "You are becoming a young lady. I can tell by your changing body that you're going to be beautiful. Men are really going to love you." And then he casually brushed his hand over her breast. This was very alarming.
touch is certainly violating the child or adolescent's body in that. But there are certainly other ways of non-touch abuse. Have it be pornography, have it be dirty jokes, or excessive language in a non-touch setting.
I immediately called our pastor into the office to address this family's incident. They needed to know that we were on their side and that we took their claim seriously. With their permission, we also met with them and their daughter later that same night. Then our pastor called our local child protection agency to find out if these actions constituted a sexual abuse claim that they would need to investigate. We knew that every state has its own reporting obligations for incidences like these, and that we were mandated by law to report any incident of child sexual abuse. Well, Child Protection definitely wanted to investigate the allegation. Knowing this, we then called our insurance company to let them know what had happened.
If anyone out of good faith suspects a child or youth is being sexually abused, you do not reach out to them. You reach out to Child Protective Services.
Yes.
Allow them to take the lead and be there as a secondary support for the child or the
That's what I meant.
family. Not to interview potential offenders, the victim, because the only guarantee we'll have then is that the victim will be re-victimized, because they will be shamed to tell their story several times to different people. And I always say there's a fine line between doing the right thing and doing what you want to do. The right thing is calling Child Protective Services, who are trained to investigate allegations.
We called Steve in for a meeting. It was tough. When he arrived, he was greeted by us and an investigator from the Child Protection Services. We let him know that an allegation had been made against him. The investigator asked Steve several questions to give him a chance to respond to the allegation. At that point, Steve wanted to contact an attorney. He was given strict orders not to contact the young girl or her family at any point from this moment on until the investigation was resolved.